Hello everyone, welcome to this rendition of Dairy Production. We're going to talk about nutrient management today. It's a really important area within livestock, especially dairy, to discuss. And so I'm going to record this lecture, and then right below this lecture on the Word document that I posted, there are links to one link to a website. It's called Dairy Cares. It's came out of California. There is a guy named Dr. Mittlener. He does a lot of research on greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, and so he has provided, there's 9 videos. They're pretty short, so don't worry. I really have enjoyed watching them, so I hope that you enjoy watching them as well. So go ahead and watch all of those, as well as listening to this lecture, but I would encourage you to listen to here first and then go look at those videos. Let's talk about nutrient management, because there are a lot of environmental concerns when we're talking about nutrient management. Some four pretty big ones are nitrates in groundwater, phosphorus in the surface water, bacteria in surface water, and then sediment and erosion control. And so let's talk about nitrates first. Nitrates are really soluble, and they will leach through the soil profile, which means that then nitrates can enter groundwater. And we have standards for human drinking water, so we need less than 10 milligrams per liter of nitrates, because if we have higher nitrates, they can cause blue baby disease. And also, when we're talking about for livestock, if there's greater than 30 grams per 100 pounds of body weight with cattle, that can result in death. So it's not just humans that we're worried about ingesting nitrates, we're also worried about livestock. And then eutrophication is another one of those 4 main problems. So eutrophication can be brought on prematurely through nutrient enrichment, and this is going to lead to excessive growth of algae. And then algae in water can result in odors and poor tasting water. And then when decaying algae occurs, that can remove oxygen from surface water, and then that's when we see harm to aquatic life and also dead fish, as you can see in that picture. Bacteria is also a concern. So bacteria either from fecal coliform or E. coli are really concerns in surface water and in the surface waters. When we have bacteria in the water, it can be fecal contamination, and indicators of that are that there is certain E. coli, like called 157H7. This is a pretty harmful E. coli. It can cause gastrointestinal illness. Dairy farms are often listed as a source of fecal coliforms and E. coli, but it's not just dairy farms, it's other sources like wildlife, birds, other livestock, things like that. So dairy often gets the blame for this, but it's not always us. Sorry if you can hear my son yelling in the background. All right, so sediment and erosion control are also a big concern. We can have buildup of sediments and waters, which can threaten aquatic life. Land conservation and erosion control practices can prevent sediment from moving into waters, but sometimes with agricultural practices, we do have sediment and erosion problems. There are federal regulations to help us control our environmental impact. So the National CAFO, which is Controlled Animal Feeding Operation, has a rule under the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination. The EPA is the one that passed this rule, and it requires states to meet their rules or lose the ability to permit anything under this National Pollutant Discharge. When this happens, states may have more stringent rules. So here in Texas, especially where we are in the Bosque River watershed, we have a pretty heavily regulated watershed where the dairy is compared to other watersheds around the country. Here in Texas, we go under the guidance of the TCEQ, and the TCEQ is the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And that group strives to protect the state's public health and natural resource consistent with sustainable economic development. And their goal is clean air, clean water, and the safe management of waste. So TCEQ is the one that looks over our permits at the dairy. They come out to the dairy a few times a year, and they drive around with our foreman looking at our waste management systems and driving out to fields. And sometimes we have accidents that happens on any farms, like if a pipe burst and we have excess discharge of manure that we normally wouldn't have, we have to report it to TCEQ, and then they may or may not fine us depending on what happens. So TCEQ is really kind of the governing body for regulations. When we're talking about environments, or talking about nutrient management regarding the environment, we have to talk about a few different types of feeding operations, and so we're going to define those here in the next few slides. So one is an animal feeding operation, and that might be something that you might be a little bit more familiar with, especially if you come from the beef industry. This is a lot or facility other than aquatic animal productions where animals will be confined for a total of 45 days or more in a 12-month period. And in this area, the animal confinement area is not going to sustain crops, vegetation, forage growth, or post-harvest residues in the normal growing season. So it's really kind of an area or lot that we're holding cattle. And then when we're talking about confined animal feeding operations, this is what we more tend to talk about when we're talking about dairy cattle. So there's different sizes. We can have 700 or more mature cows, that's milking or dry cows, 1,000 or more cattle, so this is going to include dairy calves and heifers, or 1,000 veal calves. Then when we have a medium CAFO, that can be 200 to 699 mature dairy cows, 300 to 99, cattle, dairy calves and heifers, or 300 to 99 or more veal calves. Large CAFOs are required to have a permit. However, any operation can be designated by TCEQ to have a permit. So small CAFOs may be required to be permitted if they are discharging waste from their operation, and rules are really outlined in the permit that are going to reflect the requirements of the AFOs. So we do have a permit at the dairy. Even though we're not a large CAFO, we are still required to be permitted. And so what that looks like is a nutrient management plan, or an NMP. This NMP is a plan that's developed according to the Natural Resources Practice Standard, and it really addresses the amount, source, placement, form, and timing of the application of all nutrient and soil amendments. So it's really the what, where, why, how, when type of manure management. So when we're talking about NMP, we have to talk about a CNMP, and that's a comprehensive nutrient management plan. The NMP is a part of the CNMP. Are you loving all the acronyms that we have when we're talking about the environment? So the CNMP includes additional information and plans such as land management practices, feed management, and other utilization activities, like do we have improved manure treatment systems, things like that. Now, when we're talking about nutrient management, record keeping is of the utmost importance. Just like actually when we're talking about dairy cattle and their well-being, record keeping is really important there. Record keeping is really an important part of the CAFO and the AFO permits, because accurate and complete records will show that the appropriate steps are being taken to protect the environment. It's really the only thing that you have to show that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing on a farm. Sorry, I just went ahead too far. And so our cows are secreting about 165 pounds of manure per day. So that is a lot of manure that needs to be taken care of properly. And when we're looking at not just the total manure, but when we break it down into nitrogen and phosphorus, because we're concerned about those nutrients, you can see for a lactating cow, dry cows, heifers, and calves, how much nitrogen and phosphorus is excreted per day from just one cow. So that's a lot of nutrients on the farm that need to be handled properly. So management of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium on dairy operations typically focuses on concentrations in manure. However, management of those three nutrients in feeds is important because it can improve the overall farm balance, and it can increase opportunities to decrease feed costs and improve animal health. Because phosphorus in dairy diets is important to talk about because it has a history of being overfed in dairy cattle diets. We originally fed high concentrations of phosphorus to prevent reproductive problems. However, phosphorus excretion is increased with greater phosphorus intake, which kind of makes sense. So we overfeed it because we don't want other problems on the farm. However, we have challenges with phosphorus. So there can be a lot of variations in the feeds. And when we're including these high inclusion rates of these co-product feeds, that's going to increase phosphorus concentrations, which then increases phosphorus intake, which increases phosphorus excretion. And then we need a larger land amount to handle all of the phosphorus in the manure. And so that can be a really a big problem. And so the solution is just to formulate the rations close to what the actual animal requires, and group the milking herds by production level. So if we have cows that are milking a lot, make sure they're in a group, versus cows that are not milking a lot, making sure they're in a group, and then feed them different levels of phosphorus so that they will excrete the proper amount of phosphorus and not over excrete phosphorus. Let's now look through some manure management and handling fractions. So you all have seen the flush system. So we have a flush at our dairy farm. This is a great way to handle manure. It's a great way to recycle nutrients. However, when you're getting rid of the excess effluent, you don't always have a large land base. So you may only have one pivot like we do, and that the land on the pivot can become very saturated with nutrients. And so we don't have any other place to move the pivot. It's there, the structure's in place there, and so we don't get to put as much effluent out maybe as we could in the very beginning. So while the flush system is great, there's definitely a downside in that the land underneath the pivots gets really saturated with nutrients, and that can be a problem. There's also alley scrapers, which you can see there. Those just run on a chain, and they pretty much run all the time through the barn. The cows just know to step over the alley scraper. Doesn't bother them at all. And then that manure is just being scraped down into a pit, and that looks different for different farms. Like that pit maybe has a flush system that's bringing manure out to another area. Maybe it's on a slope system. It just depends on the farm. You can manually scrape. So you can see in the top right hand corner a scrape tire, and so you can scrape manure down into a holding area, or you can use a bucket like in the bottom left hand. Honey vacs are really popular in this part of the world, and so that has a squeegee that's located right behind the tractor, and so as the tractor drives through the barn, it's just going to scrape the alleyway and suck up all of the manure. One really great thing about this is that you can, if you're in the right area and the weather permits and your permit says you can go directly land apply the manure, so you don't have to, as soon as you suck it up, so you don't have to worry about holding the manure in like another lagoon or anything like that. So that's a really nice aspect of the Hummingbird. If you're in a dry lot, you can drag the dry lots to break up the manure and make the land not so hard and keep it dry. And then there are different types of areas for lagoons. So you have settling basins. You all have seen this at the dairy after the flush cleans out the barn and the manure goes underneath the dirt caliche road. Where it first goes before it goes to the manure, that is a settling basin. And so we're settling the dry manure out there, and then we have, so you can see that in these few pictures. And then we have weeping walls, not to this extent. We have weeping walls that will weep out the liquid from the dry manure, and it will flow down into the lagoon. And so these are big weeping walls that I've seen on farms before, and so it'll kind of leach out all of the urine, manure, water, things like that to go down into a lagoon. You can also use screens to separate the solids from the liquids that you can see in these two pictures. That's called solid separation. And then you can compost. So you can, that's a windrow composter. You're putting dry manure out into windrows to compost. Some farms, I haven't seen this here in Texas. I'm sure it's available. I just haven't seen it. But some small farms that I've seen throughout the country, they actually sell compost as a side business for growing gardens. These are kind of an older style, but I still see these slurry stores. They're manure storage tanks. They're pretty popular up in the Midwest. It's basically like a lagoon to me above land. And then we have lagoons, which you all have seen at the dairy center as well. So we have a two-stage lagoon where the first stage is really just for holding, and then the second stage is where we are pumping out the effluent up into the storage tank for the flush system and over to the pivot, and we have a traveling gun as well to irrigate our plant. Which you can see here, this is a picture of a pivot, not our pivot, of a pivot, so we can put both effluent and fresh water and harvest the grass that's underneath the pivot for consumption. And that's just a traveling gun. It's not ours, but it's very similar traveling. You can also apply manure in different ways besides just the pivot gun. You can surface apply it. So this would be like the honey vac, where you just go out to the land and you surface apply it. You can inject it. A lot of times farms will inject the manure into the soil if they don't want the odor to bother the neighbors. So like when we have cleaned out our lagoon in the past at the dairy center, the company that we've worked with, they injected the nutrients right into the ground so that it didn't smell the odor as bad. All right, let's talk about air emissions from feeding operations, because we definitely have some air quality issues that we need to talk about. So odors, volatile compounds, and dust are all a problem. Just ask some of our neighbors at the dairy center what they think about our odor at the dairy center, and they will tell you they don't love it. We actually get complaints quite a bit on the dairy. Luckily, whenever we get a complaint, we're never doing anything wrong. It's just the smell of the dairy, so we don't get fined or anything like that. So when we're looking at sources of odors from cattle operations, You can see that the way that slurry is stored and spread is where the highest odor comes from. After that, it's buildings, silage storage, and then just animal feed production. So multiple gases really contribute to odor. So volatile fatty acids, nitrogen containing compounds, and sulfur containing compounds all contribute to the from a dairy. And when we're talking about impacts, it's really hard to pinpoint the impacts always, because it's really hard to put a definite number on like community nuisance, but it is a problem. We have it, as I just stated, at the dairy, that we get complaints about odor. And the TCEQ comes out to the dairy and they say we're not doing anything wrong, but it's not, we don't have very many friendly neighbors, so it is a problem. It also has physiological impacts on neighbors, so they think it is, if they have respiratory problems, they're concerned. Sometimes it makes people sick. I see that at the dairy when we have city kids come in and take tours. Sometimes the smell does not agree with them. And then it has psychological impacts on neighbors, so anger and depression can occur. These are actually real things that do happen from people that live around dairy farms. So we should try to reduce our odor, which we do actually at the dairy. Whenever we get a complaint, we don't spread on in the summertime on certain fields that we know are going to impact neighbors the way that the wind is and the heat and everything. We do try to manage which fields we're going to spread manure on, and so we can have actually like an odor management plan. We can also try to reduce manure buildup. You could do a type of lagoon cover. We don't do that. Have windbreaks and biofilters to try to reduce the odor. You can also monitor odor on the farm, at the farm boundaries as well, like at the neighbors, and then build good relationships with neighbors in the community. A lot of times, if you know that you're going to clean out the lagoon, telling your neighbors before you're going to clean out the lagoon is really important, because maybe they're having a huge birthday party on the day that you're going to clean out the lagoon and you need to wait a day. And so just little things like that just really help having good neighbors. When we're talking about air emissions, ammonia is a problem. It's a gas that is lighter than air and really has a sharp, pungent odor. Large quantities of ammonia are released in livestock systems, and so it can lead to reduced visibility in the barn if it's really bad, but also a lot of respiratory diseases. And then when we're talking just about farms in general, particulate matter in the air can be a problem. It usually results from any type of mechanical activity. So if people are driving down roads, if they're working in the fields or working in the dry lots, it can cause a lot of dust to just stir up into the air. And then hydrogen sulfide is another gas that we need to talk about. It's heavier than air, and it's really that rotten egg smell. So this occurs from anaerobic fermentation, and it can be a reduction of sulfate in the water by microbes or decomposition of organic matter. And livestock emissions are relatively small, important on national levels, but it happens. When we're talking about in the environment, we need to talk about greenhouse gases. So carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. These are all really important greenhouse gases. We all hear in the news differences about, well, agriculture is awful. They have the most greenhouse gases. No, it's transportation. And so we're going to look at here at a graph in just a moment that shows you the emission levels. So when we're talking about those greenhouse gases, and methane is an emission that occurs from all parts of livestock operations, so ruminant animals and manure handling. It's emitted directly from ruminant animals, and it is, that doesn't always happen from the other gases that are of concern. So the anaerobic fermentation is the main source of emissions from livestock, which is the methanogenic bacteria that causes the methane release. So challenges that we have are enteric fermentation. So that occurs in cattle, and so it's going to cause emissions. And then manure management, liquid systems are definitely going to increase emissions. And so if we look at this pie graph here, we can see on the very kind of left, if we're looking at like 8 o'clock, the agricultural it accounts for 12.5% of gas emissions by sector, and then transportation is 14%, and industry processes is 16%, and then power stations are 21%. There's some different numbers that you will see being thrown around, but the most important take home from this is that agriculture is not the highest emission like we see from some reports. When we look at the carbon footprint of milk, we are really efficient. So compared to 1944 to 2006, we have decreased the land that we needed by 4 times, and the methane, we've decreased that by 2.6 times. So we are really efficient in producing milk compared to 1944. All right, so don't forget to go and watch those videos now by Dr. Mittliner. They're really useful when talking about the environment. All right, I'll talk to you all later. Bye.